the first question is about grading. How do I grade essays since overall they should be growing and improving? Do you have benchmarks for each essay? So that's from Kelly. So Beth, I don't know if you heard that, but just think about grading in the back of your mind as you try to work through a couple of other things, right? Kelly, when it comes to grading, I have a sliding scale for grading that works to get kids to develop a better, like the idea is that kids are going to build their skills over the year. So I use the sliding scale throughout the year, and I'll actually see if I can't share that with y'all. And what it basically does is if a kid gets a 5 out of 6 points in the first term, then I would expect that if a kid gets a 5 out of 6 in term 2, then it's not going to be a 96 anymore. It's going to be like a 93. I want that student to really be working towards getting a 6 out of 6 points each way. Excuse me. And so when it comes to the idea of growing and improving, because I use this sliding scale, I encourage my kids like, hey, listen, a 6 out of 6 will always be between a 98 and a 100. That's what it comes down to. But a 5 out of 6 for term 1 will be, let's say, a 94 to a 97. And then the next term, though, it's going to be like a 91 to a 97. And then term 3, it's going to be a 90 to a 97. And I keep that range open, and I open it wider and wider as the term goes on, because I want to be able to have more room to be like, look, if you're a stagnant 5 writer, I'm glad that you're a good writer, but I want to see you progress as a writer. I don't particularly always care just about the essay score for the AP exam. The other thing, too, is that I try not to grade actual essays with the AP exam rubric, because honestly, that's an exam rubric. Like a thesis, evidence and commentary, and sophistication. I mean, if I'm going to grade an essay, I want to actually focus on potentially other things. I might want to focus on a full introduction. I might want to focus on how they write their conclusion and things like that. So for AP exam instruction type of essays like timed writes and stuff, I use my sliding scale, and then it gets progressively harder. And then, it gets progressively open. So what scored a 5 term 1 gets a little bit, wider in term 2 and term 3. And then, but with a process paper, I'll actually just give a straight rubric for that. There's no doubt about that. And then I don't know what you mean by the benchmarks for each essay. If I have like benchmarks that I give kids to show the essay, I would ask that you clarify that in the piece. Am I still echoey? I'm sorry, Beth. Am I echoey on your side?
No.
Oh, and you're not echoey on my side.
We've got it figured out.
Solid win. So think about grading here. Okay. I'm so pumped. Folks, thank you so much for your patience, by the way. I know it's not ideal to have to work through tech issues and feedback, but this is what we're trying to perfect right now so that we don't have to do that with the kids next week. So anyway, Beth, why don't you think about grading here? And I'm going to pull up my sliding grading scale, okay?
Okay, sounds good. So I have a slightly different approach, but I really like the sliding idea. We have the same, I guess, rubric and scoring system for Lang and Lit. And so it's in intervals of 10. And that might seem really harsh, but we have plenty of other grades for the students that it offsets, like if they score poorly. So a 6 is 100, a 5 is a 90, a 4 is an 80, that kind of thing. And then I also give half points if a student's showing improvement, but they haven't necessarily gone up on the rubric. And so far that's worked well at our school. But like I said, we have a lot of other assignments in the gradebook that offset one low test grade. So students haven't complained about the system, but it makes it a lot easier for them to know when they see the grade in the gradebook, what they got. Obviously they get the paper back and they get comments too. And then it's just easier for us to remember. So that's kind of what I did with the teacher who teaches Lit at our school. That works for us, but I think there's plenty of ways to do it. I think if you're trying to demonstrate growth, I think the sliding scale is a great way to do that.
Yeah. I'm actually going to see if I can't share that right now. Let me see if I can share my screen. And yeah, I have it right here. Beth, you got to confirm that it's up if it's there. Do you see that?
Yeah, it's there.
Okay. So this right here is my sliding scale. And it kind of gets kids a rough estimate. And the truth be told, this is actually inaccurate, folks. Let's just dispel a couple. Oh, you know what? What, you do see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so what's inaccurate is the idea that if a kid writes a 5 on all of his or her essays, that it's going to be an AP exam score of 4. There's typically very little difference for a kid who writes, statistically speaking, that is, for a kid who writes all 4s and a kid who all 5s, that's like a 140. So a 5 out of 6, as opposed to a 6 out of 6. There's a remarkably low statistical difference between those kids not scoring a 5 and a 4. So truth be told, a lot of the, if a kid scores a 5 on an essay and can do that on all 3, most likely that student will be really, really close, if not in the 5 range on exam day. This is just a rough guesstimate. But what you'll notice here is that, for my first 2 terms, if the kids score a 6 on an essay, I will give them a score between a 95 and 100. I thought it was 98 for some reason. And that doesn't change throughout the whole year. We want the kids kind of in the 6 range, especially on the timed writing side of things. But you'll notice that the kid who gets the 5 at the beginning of the year, I typically score it from like a 92 to a 94, even though I reserve the right to go down to an 88. But, if I've got, a student and that student is writing the exact same in May, I'm like, man, what haven't I done? So that's why this is so nice and open here, because by term 4, if that student is writing the same paper that student was writing in term 1, I'm probably going to give that student an 85 or an 84, even if it scores a 140, because it's like, hey, I need to hear some new voice from you, or I need to see some new advanced punctuation from you, or I need to see any of those types of things. So what's nice about this is that this actually allows me to differentiate my grading as well as I use this sliding scale, and my students know it. So sometimes a B- for one student is not necessarily the same exact B- as for another student. And I do try to keep them, pretty, I guess, normed. However, if I have a student who gives me a paper that should have been a 100 and it was a good paper, but it was not the student's best, I have no problem giving that student a B+ and be like, well, that's not Kayla's A-, or that's not Kayla's A+, that's a B+ in Kayla's book. And so I use my sliding scale to kind of give me some leeway to do that, so I can differentiate some scoring and whatnot for my kids, because I've got so many other activities in my grade book that one poor grade, like you said, for my student named Kayla, like, she'll get her B-. I let my kids rewrite everything anyway, so she can rewrite it again, and I'll be like, give me a an A+ for Kayla here, and then my students can rewrite it as well. But I could typically pad their grades that way. So that's my answer to the grading question, and that's my sliding scale right there. And if anybody needs access to that, I can show you where to access that as well. Okay. Another question that showed up in here, Beth, is preparing kids for evidence. So what do you do to prepare your kids for evidence for argument? I'll talk about what I do to prepare kids for evidence for argument, and then we'll move on to the next question that shows up in here. Folks, while you're in here, if you have questions about anything that you want us to discuss, even if it's just teaching English related, by all means, toss them in the chat. We'll try to get through as many as we can throughout the hour that we have kind of allotted for this, and maybe you'll be able to glean some information from us. But we really appreciate you working with us as we work out the kinks in tech. Beth, take it away.
So for evidence, I tried something slightly new this year. I kind of have done variations of this in the past, but I have an out-of-class assignment each week where I have students listen to a podcast that I've selected, a TED Talk, read an article. Sometimes it's related to what we're doing in class. So for instance, this week, the text that we're looking at is Queen Liliuokalani. I might be saying her name wrong, but her letter to President McKinley. And so I selected an article that I wanted them to read outside of class to kind of look at some modern day events that are going on in Hawaii. And they actually have a sub at one point this week who are listening to the podcast in class. But that way they have like supplemental information beyond just doing a rhetorical analysis. And I'll know once we get the exam scores this year if it helped or not, because obviously we can't predict the prompts. But I think sometimes there's a trend of like, if students are familiar with different historical events, current events, or historical figures that deal with adversity or struggle or progress or change, and they can speak about these specifically, then that helps. So sometimes the assignment that I do is just like a really simple assignment that's out of class, that's tied to what we're reading. Other times it's kind of generic. Like we just got back from spring break, and the week before spring break, the assignment that I had them do was like, go to allsides.com and write a summary of the different articles from the different biases that are there. So sometimes it's kind of arbitrary, just current event stuff, and other times it's more connected. And I found that helps because some of the stuff that we're talking about or that students end up writing about is tied to what they're learning in other classes. So like my students who are in APUSH or trying to think what else my students currently take. We have a small school, so we don't have as many APs, but like they can draw on stuff from maybe like AP Bio that they've learned. So that can really help too. But sometimes they don't realize that because they're in English class, they should be drawing on like history. So we're trying to get them to realize that like, hey, you have a wealth of knowledge that extends far beyond like TikTok and whatever. There's some show that my students keep talking about. But beyond TV and TikTok, like you actually know some more like in-depth evidence that you can draw from. So trying to get them to realize that they have this arsenal with them that they can actually draw upon and be specific enough about to get credit.
Yeah. So Beth and I do things a little bit differently. Do you still chores with them or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Someone said, "Is it Euphoria?" Yes, it's Euphoria. They will not stop talking about whatever that show is.
I think that's got Zendaya in it or something like that. And it's on, I think it's on HBO or Showtime or something like that. But anyway, that just shows, I'm a little bit disconnected when it comes to that kind of a thing. When it comes to evidence for me, the acronym that I make my kids use is just S-cubed. And it just stands for subject, society, and self. And the kids know that they have to kind of go in that order. Subjects first. So whatever subjects I know from in school, I want to pull evidence from there. Then society. Society would be anything like pop culture, art, literature, religion, and sports. So anything from society they could pull as an example, and then self. And there are some prompts that allow kids to write about themselves a lot better than other prompts. And I always tell kids, like, you need to think about that. Like the ownership and sense of self prompt, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about anybody but yourself when you could easily do that. What do I own? How does that relate to me and my understanding of my own self-identity? Why am I talking about what Justin Bieber owns and how that relates to his self-identity? Because no student knows how Justin Bieber actually views himself. I mean, I guess that Taylor Swift gave us a little bit of some insight from the Netflix documentary. So if a student wanted to use Taylor Swift for something like that, then that's fine. But that prompt is really like handpicked for a student to talk about, the self in that. So I tell my kids, like, really look at the prompt. But the other day, let's be real. The best ideas typically come to teachers when they're either, on a long car ride and they can't write anything down, or when they're in the shower and they can't write anything down, or like at 3 o'clock in the morning when you wake up in a cold sweat and you're like, oh my gosh, I got to remember that in the morning. I will. And then you wake up in the morning and you're like, what was I thinking? Well, the other day I actually woke up in a cold sweat on a Saturday and I was like, I have a new evidence kind of thing. And this is brand new, hot off the press. I haven't tried it, but I'm going to, encourage you all to consider such things. I'm going to at least give my reasoning behind it for evidence. So I'm going to share up my screen right here. We'll see if we can get this to, yeah, there we go. Good. All right. And we'll try to see if I can get it off my face. There it is. So I was thinking about beginning to assign this, and I'm going to start this next year. But each week, I'm going to ask my students to be reflective over the weekend, or maybe at the beginning of the week and say, hey, this is due on Friday. But I want to ask them to do these things. Briefly, yet precisely, describe 2 of the most impactful moments in your life. And I want kids to think about anything here. Now, if they're doing this each week of the school all the way up until exam day, I mean, they have now precisely thought about, probably close to 40 events in their life that mean something, or maybe only one per week. I don't know. But then you'll notice that this one, right? So personal experience, this one would be the experience of an acquaintance, right? So think about people that you know that have told you about impactful moments in their lives and try to describe that precisely. And then, hey, think about something that's impactful that you've experienced from the media over the past week, and 1 to 2. And then, hey, what about some contemporary cultural knowledge from history that you're like, this means something to me, whether it's your own culture, whether it's something you learned in history class. And the only reason why I'm thinking about doing this as an assignment for next year, starting on Mondays, and then having it due on Fridays, because it's an easy check grade for me. But at the end of the year, your students will have, or my students in this case, will have really thought about a lot of meaningful moments in culture, in their own lives, in the media they experience, and their acquaintances and their friends. And I can't imagine that having that at the forefront of their mind the day before the exam, going over that when they get an exam prompt, they will not have examples at their fingertips to use. I just can't picture it. And this is so nice and broad and generic. And the key part here is this idea of precisely, like getting the kids to be precise. So when they say one day I got in a fight with my mom, I want them to actually be like, no, 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 no. I want you to precisely tell me what was going on. And, not school appropriate stuff, of course, right? And that kind of a thing. But I mean, this is a great bell ringer too. If you want to get kids prepared for exam up until now, this might be something that you'll want to do as a bell ringer. But I think that I'm going to try to really start building kids' experience. But when kids write precisely, I always tell them, when you describe anything precisely, you got to focus on those verbs. I don't want to say that you fought with your mom. I want you to tell me what was going on and then say, my mom challenged me with this, so I disrespectfully retorted. Really trying to get kids to write precisely there, and they're going to have a lot of examples. So that's just a couple ways that I work with. Well, I'm going to start working with examples that way next year, but this year I just do the 3 S's: the subject, society, and self. So that's that. And did you catch any other questions in the chat while I was talking?
We have one about sophistication. So okay. What strategies do you use to help them achieve the sophistication point? The person, Allison, said, I have writers who aren't amazing, sophisticated writers, so they're going to have to get the point through another route. What's the best way for students to get that point?
Yeah. You want to answer that first?
Sure. So honestly, for most of my year, I don't even really focus on sophistication because I feel like students really need to work on evidence and commentary since that's 2/3 of their score. But we start to have conversations about sophistication maybe toward the end of the first semester. And we have to remember that there's different ways that they can earn the point. And so sometimes it's, suited to a certain student's style. But the one that I have found my students do the best with is this idea of situating the issue in a broader context. And this might help with another question we had about conclusions. So this is just going to be for rhetorical analysis for right now, but it kind of applies to the others. One thing that we started doing in class is just kind of like talking about, okay, what are the deeper implications of this message? So if we read a speech, how is this message relevant today? And then when they would write an essay about it, if I would encourage them to in their conclusion, talk about that. So things like Madeleine Albright, her commencement speech. Well, it's been 20 plus years since she gave that speech. So I would have students consider, okay, what is relevant about that message today? And it doesn't always earn them the sophistication point, but what it does do is it in some sense helps their commentary, and also it helps them start to write a deeper paper, because we have to remember that while the exam is the end goal for many of our students, we also want to foster strong writers, and they're not always going to be writing 4 or 5 paragraph timed essays. So the situating it in a broader context helps. And for argument and synthesis, I just have them think about how does this impact society today, short term or long term. And yeah, sometimes they do give me really superficial answers, but overall, I'm trying to get them to extend their thinking. And that to me has been more effective throughout the year. We do little grammar exercises for style, but I can't say that has drastically helped anyone except my students who are creative writers, but they usually have a strong voice anyway. So I don't know. Those are just kind of the things that I've been working on this year.
All right. And I'm going to actually share up the sophistication parts of the rubric. I just looked that up while you were sharing. So thank you for that, Beth. And I do think that the broader context is one of the most accessible ways to get the sophistication point. I'm going to talk about a couple things here, though, as well. When it comes to sophistication, first thing I always ask students, I actually had a student call me from California last week, and he reached out to me and I said, you got to call me. I can't, I'm grocery shopping right now. I'll address your question. Just give me a call. So I sent him my number and he called and he was like, what about sophistication? And the first question I asked was, do you consistently write a 140 in your class? Because if you're not consistently writing a 140, you don't need to worry about 1 point. when you need to worry about 4 points just on test day. Like that's what it really comes down to. And knowing that the sophistication point doesn't typically, for the most part, it is not the difference between a kid scoring a 3 and a 5. And it's not the difference between a kid scoring a 4 and a 5. I always tell my students, like, look, it's cool to want to get it, but if we can do the thesis and we can do the evidence and commentary, chances are the sophistication point will come. And if it won't come, it's still okay. So that's the kind of thing that I always try to tell my kids, to get them away from just focusing on one point as opposed to not focusing on where they can get the most points on test day. And the truth is that, you know, although I prepare my kids for test day, I want them to just be good writers and know how to produce good commentary anyway. But I want to just make a couple points here for kids that, you know, there are a couple ways to kind of do things. For this part right here, number 1 on synthesis, it says crafting a nuanced argument by consistently identifying and exploring complexities or tensions across the sources. A really good example of this that I give my students a lot is kind of having like a snarky voice. And they're like, wait, what do you mean by that? And I'm like, well, you know, in the essay where is college worth the cost, you know, you could pull data from the guy who's the president of that liberal arts college that says like, hey, here's why it's great to go to college. But when you put that source in there, in that information, just at the very end, have that little moment where you're like, says the dude who's the president of liberal arts college, who's lining his pockets with this, and then continue on. Like having those small moments, not even necessarily, like some kids are incredibly sarcastic and can do it well, but those small moments that just recognize elements of bias that don't discredit the use of the evidence, but kind of add that little parenthetical, that's a great way to kind of explore the complexity and the tension of the source in the argument without taking away from your argument a lot. My friend Christian Kuhn told me, he's like, you know, if you allow kids to mix their academic voice with some colloquial voice in there, with like, but pointed, it's going to sound really good. And he's right. I had a lot of kids last year that were like, hey, can we put a little aside in here or a little quip? And as long as it's really, really short but consistent, it came out pretty cool. So you got to see some voice development, and that's one of the ways to do it. The broader context is what you just spoke about. I do that in my conclusion as well. For anybody that's looking for some conclusion stuff, I know that Beth has a lot of conclusion videos on her YouTube channel, which is Coach Hall Writes. I'm the Garden of English, so I've got conclusion videos there where I have steps for conclusions for kids. And if they go through the 3 steps, hands down, the conclusion is going to rock. And so you might want to consider checking that out. But a lot of times it does situate things in a broader context. The best way to get kids to do that with conclusions is before they write their paper, have them say, by the time someone is done with my paper, I want the reader to, and make them articulate what they want the reader to do. Because when at the end of the conclusion, if the kid doesn't feel like the reader would do that, then the kid has not produced the conclusion that he or she wants. So that's just something to consider there. The next thing here, 3 and 4 really are kind of similar points here. But interestingly enough, when it says employing a vivid style, I think that my students often get that sophistication point, even though my kids use templates a lot, because I show them how to move the templates around so that they can actually have varied sentence structure, and, you know, use synonyms. And although their writing is well constructed, I guess, it's nothing to write home about. But you know, I do know that my kids do get the sophistication point a decent amount. And I know how they write. And sometimes I'm like, 40% of my kids got it on that essay. How is that possible? And I think that a lot of times it comes to this idea of the templates that I give my kids are really complex sentences consistently. So because it forces them to produce complex sentences and use advanced punctuations with the templates that I provide, I think that that's a good opportunity for the kids to kind of show what is deemed to be sophisticated. So if you want your kids to do that, you can encourage them to have a little bit of voice by putting in some asides that are purposeful, that relate to something that's going on. And then encourage your kids to learn how to use advanced punctuation as they go through. And I tell my kids, complex ideas are communicated in compound and complex sentences. So I show them, how do we use conjunctions well and purposely? How do we use coordinated conjunctions purposely? How do we use subordinated conjunctions purposely? And that's how I build that all kind of in there together for that. And then for rhetorical analysis, this sophistication point, when it comes to the rhetorical situation, this is for the kid who's the history buff. That's going to be by situating it in the broader context. The kid who's the history buff can nail that one. That's a really cool thing. So if you know your kids are taking AP US or if they're taking AP Euro, kind of getting that involved can be super cool for that. So that's what I have for elements of sophistication. I'll stop sharing my screen right there. Beth, if you want to try to find another question, I just want to address one thing that Kelly asked earlier about the grading. She asked if I have basically like a let me see here if I get this right. Okay, by quarter one, they should be at like A, B, C, or D. My answer to that is no. I don't have benchmarks for that right now, Kelly, but I am moving towards standard-based grading where I will have that so that kids can actually self-assess themselves. And that's probably going to be in 2 years when I start that up because I have to create the plan for my admin so I can be like, here's how I want to do benchmarks gradings, and here's how I want this to actually look on a transcript.
So one question in the chat was, what are the best tips for methodical students who are only finishing half the multiple choice questions in the set time? Which is really interesting because obviously there's a pacing issue going on there. They might be those like perfectionist type students who kind of like can't move on until they're sure they're right, but then they're like actually hurting themselves because the multiple choice section is worth 45% of their composite. And there are 45 questions. So essentially each question is 1 point. So what I tell my students is we don't want to waste time on one question where we could be getting 2 or 3 other questions right. And I would also say one thing with that situation is if you've given them a full length test, either the 3 that are on AP Classroom or like Marco Learning has a good one that I've used with some of my
tutoring. I think the Garden of English has one too.
Oh, yes. And of course, there's the ultimate review packet that has some in it as well. I don't make multiple choice stuff. It's not my zone of genius. So just other people do that. But what I've done with some of my students, I even did it today with a practice thing that we did, is I've looked at their accuracy. So if their pacing is off, what's their accuracy? Are they very accurate with reading? Are they very accurate with the writing? Because I have a couple students this year who are actually much better at the writing questions than the reading questions. And if they start with the reading questions, they spend way too much time on it. And then when they get to the part that they're good at, they have too little time to actually do well and they're rushing. So today I actually pulled up the course exam description, printed the multiple choice questions that are in that. There are 17 of them. And I had a student who is stronger at writing. I told her, I want you to start with question 9 because that's where the writing questions start. And I want you to answer the writing questions first, and then I want you to go back to the reading. And I timed them, and she was much more accurate, and she felt much more confident by that process. And she said, I didn't miss any of the writing, and I honestly didn't care if I missed any of the reading because I knew I had already done my strong suit. The only downside to this, and obviously it varies from student to student, I'm not saying all students should try that, but if they do take the test slightly out of order to try to get more points, they must be accurate on their bubble sheet. But that was something I noticed with the ones that were too slow, is they were spending too much time on the questions that they were struggling with anyway. And so it was kind of like a let's play to your strengths experiment. But something else too is have them physically cross out using the process of elimination answers that they know are wrong. If one word in the answer makes it wrong, it's still wrong. Because I've had some kids be like, well, most of the answer is right, but this one word is wrong, but it sounds good. And then they talk themselves out of the right answer because they're tripping up over literally one word. So I think there's this moment where they have to kind of internally realize I have to be quicker. But also, for what it's worth, Timm has some great videos on the lead distractor and other things too. So if they know how the answer choices are put together, if they know that of the 5, there's a couple that are just automatic no answers, or there's one that might be beyond the scope of the passage or something like that. If they can get rid of those, they should pick up their speed anyway. So definitely check out his video on that because that might help their pacing as well.
Yeah. Just about that with pacing. I think that giving a mock exam, if you can, it's entirely worth it so that kids get the full experience before May. I do it every single year, and my students are like, thank you for that. So when they go in May and they have to experience the 3.5 hours almost in order, they're like, it ain't our first rodeo. So if there's an opportunity for you to do that, and sometimes I have teachers that are like, well, how can I do that? And because the kids aren't going to come in on a Saturday, they're not going to stay after school, and perhaps there are reasons for that, and very viable, incredibly viable reasons for doing that. I would encourage you, if you have only 40-minute periods, well, then take that 1 week and say, look, you've got 40 minutes to start your multiple choice today. Tomorrow, you've got 20 minutes of the class. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to start our essay time, and we're going to do this whole thing throughout the week. You don't have to grade that, and you can actually have the kids score their multiple choice. And if you're like, yeah, but what about all the essays? Just recently in the AP Link Facebook groups, I turned all of the rubrics into generic questions that kids can ask about their own papers, so they can actually self-assess their own papers. And so you can find that in the file section of the AP Lane group. I haven't put it on my website yet. I will, though, because getting kids to self-assess is a great way to get them thinking about their thinking, which also then speeds up their thinking. When it comes to multiple choice, knowing one of the things that's been a game changer for my students is I tell them what the major wrong answers look like typically. Now, this is not from the College Board. This is not dogmatic. It's not like when College Board writers write the questions, they're told to do it this way. But I have noticed over the last 13 years of teaching AP Lang that there are a few different types of wrong questions. First, wrong answers. The first wrong answer is always 100% wrong. And most kids can kind of knock that out. The other ones, though, kind of get a little dicey because there's one answer that always has half of it that's right, like Beth said, and the other half is not. And the reason why kids get, flutter with that is because that makes them question their own reading comprehension when they kind of have a lack of confidence in that in the first place. So they know the other answer is actually right, but they don't know that the wrong part is actually wrong because they're like, oh, I misread that. Well, my students now, if they know the other one is fully right, they don't even question if they misread it. That answer is not even on the docket anymore. Another example of the kind of lead distractor is it's a kind of more vague version of the correct answer because kids have to find the best answer. And so my example is, if it says what does Freitas rely on the most to appeal to his audience, and someone says emotions, and then the next answer is laughter. Well, the better answer is laughter if I was telling jokes. And so because of that, I tell kids, you want to be the most precise with your answer as humanly possible. And then the last one is it's the answer is entirely correct, which this one screws up the kids the most because the answer is entirely correct, but not for that particular question. Mm-hmm. But when my students know that they're looking for those kind of 3 little tricks, because of that, things get pretty well taken care of. I do have one student, though, who absolutely, for the life of him, will not finish the multiple choice within an hour. And that's okay. And he knows that that's his limitation. So he and I have a deal. He gets to work hardcore for the first 55 minutes. And he can get as far as he humanly can in those first 55 minutes. And if that's only 25 questions, then it's only 25 questions. But in the last 5 minutes, he promises me that he will bubble in at least every other answer. And that has actually worked out really well. Last year, this student did that, and he didn't even finish one of his essays because he just couldn't get to it, and he got a 4 on his exam because he did his methodical thing. And he's like, I know that if I get 2 1-4 zeros and then a 1-2 0, I get 13 points. That's way better than me getting 3 1-2 zeros, which is 9 points. So he, coming up with a kind of exam day strategy with those students who are extra methodical, I think can really help ease their affective filter when it comes to exam day, because they're like, wait a second, I have a plan on how to get in here. And that might be doing multiple choice at different sections and different times, but it also might not.
Yeah, the game day plan is really important. I actually just uploaded a video over the weekend on my YouTube channel, an exercise that I do with my students, and it's very similar to what Tim is talking about. Sometimes we have to be very individual with students and help them play to their strengths. So like little things like don't leave an answer blank if you can avoid it. Or if you don't have enough time for an essay, at least write a thesis and try to get to one example of evidence and commentary, something to kind of like build their score. But I had a student with a very similar issue, and I told that student, hey, in the last 5 minutes, you pick a letter, I don't care what it is, and just bubble it in. And then if you can go back and change 1 or 2, fine. But they actually kind of got like 3 or 4 more points that way just by just pure guessing letters. So, you got to play to the constraints of the test.
Yeah. So I want to just shout out to Andrea here. So I actually know Andrea. I think you're in Texas, if I remember correctly. So Andrea, thanks for joining and always being so supportive. I'm so grateful for you, and your support. She asked about being behind due to an honors class and whatnot. And I'm actually going to answer another question here too, which talks about like how many essays do kids read or how many essays do I give? I'm going to try to answer all of these in one shot, okay? Because they all kind of fit with what Andrea has said here. And Andrea, I'd like to just point out that I'm more behind this year than I've ever been any other year in my entire life. Okay. I am at the equivalent of the end of unit 6 right now. And that doesn't even bother me at all. Not one bit. And the reason why is because the cool thing about AP Lang is this. If the kids have experienced all 3 of the essays, to some extent, they have experienced all of the skills of the class. And units 7, 8, and 9 in particular are more nuanced versions of a lot of the content that shows up in units 1 through 6. So if you're feeling behind, first of all, like I'm totally with you. Okay. But if you know that your kids have experienced all 3 of the essays, you can know that they have enough experience to go into exam day with a decent amount of confidence to saying, all right, I at least know what I'm doing on the essays. And because of that, they actually had to have practiced a lot of the skills that are showing up on the multiple choice. So I wouldn't worry as much as we might do as teachers, because we're like, oh, we're failing our kids and whatnot. Now that brings me to this next question, which is how many essays do I do with my kids? And there was a reading question too. So someone asked about like reading a lot of essays and short essays. For me, I don't read a ton of pieces with my kids. By the time we're done at the end of the year, I think we've probably read 20 essays. I don't do any longer works, and I do about 20 essays in total. And when it comes to writing, so far this year, my students have written 6 essays. 5 of those 6 have been timed. So I only do one major research paper throughout the year to teach process writing. And then I do all timed writings besides that. However, what I do with my timed writings is every one of my students is always allowed to revise his or her timed writing. Every time, guaranteed. And that doesn't really hurt my grading, because what happens is I give them 2 weeks from when I turn it back, and they're going to come back and they're going to revise their paper, which is part of the writing process. And they can add a full conclusion to make it better. They can add, a full intro and a full conclusion to make it better. Because when they do their timed writings for me, they just do a thesis and their body paragraphs and a conclusion. They can fix everything. So I'm actually teaching process writing through the timed writing, but they don't really know that. They think that they just have their one major paper throughout the year, and I kind of bring in the other stuff on the backside. But I started allowing my students to do rewrites for full marks. Like, this isn't like you get to make up half of that grade. If they got a 70 and they come back and they write a 95, I'm putting the 95 in my grade book. And since I started doing that with my kids, first of all, a lot of my kids will take care of it. They know that I don't put comments on the second time through. I just read it and score it, and then we're good. No comments that time. But it takes me 3 minutes to read their paper. I know if it's better, and I have seen my kids be so much more willing to take risk on timed writing day because they know that they're able to make it up later. And because they can make it up later, they really force themselves to learn the skills because they're redoing it again and they're being metacognitive about what they need to change. And then they're like, oh, I think I want to try to get the sophistication point on my rewrite. And so they go and develop a really nice introduction or a conclusion. And that right there, when they get to the next timed writing, I already see a huge progression. So I think I've written 5 timed essays up until now, and they just turned in their rough draft for their major paper. And truth be told, if they only wrote 4 timed writings up until now, I still wouldn't care, because I know what that kind of pacing is. So anyway, sorry for talking too much, Beth.
Oh, no, it's totally fine. I tend to assign a few more essays, but something that I did this year that was really helpful is I had my students on 2 consecutive Thursdays write a timed write. And so they wrote it one week, and then the next week, the next Thursday, they wrote a different timed write about a piece we had been talking about in class. And then I told them, of these 2, I'm grading 1. So you tell me which one you want me to grade. And the other one, you're going to have to meet with a peer. And I have like a peer editing checklist that they had to fill out, and they had to like kind of like self-assess on that one. So they got the experience of 2, and I only had to look at 1. And I think that was helpful too. And one question that I saw in the chat from Angela that I think kind of relates to this is basically asking, how do you balance skill building with other activities and assigning full essays? Basically just kind of like this idea of, you know, we don't want to assign too much rating, but also we want to make sure they're doing the skills. One of the best things that I have found, starting with my 10th graders, my honors 10, but I also do it in AP Lang, more so at the beginning of the year, but also sometimes around this point in the year, is just having them write a paragraph, because good paragraphs lead to good essays. So we will do an exercise where we just practice introductions, or we just practice conclusions, or I might time them and have them write a body paragraph. And that way they're still getting used to some gentle time constraints, but they still get to experiment. And I'm working on skills, but at the same time, they're not writing full essays all the time. So that has really helped me, because a paragraph is usually pretty quick for me to grade. And at the same time, usually those skills will transfer to their essays as well.
Yeah. I'm going to shift here to, I don't want to forget the vocabulary questions. There was a question about vocabulary in here, but I'm going to address that after the one about synthesis development and argument development. There's a question that says, how do you help students with developing connections between paragraphs? And then it says, my kids are good with coming up with multiple pieces of evidence, but they struggle with figuring out how to always connect their body paragraphs in some way. And so that's a really good question. And like I said, I'll address the vocab one after, but I want to do this one first, just because one of the things that I force my students to do is I give them I can't say a template, but I give them for the lack of a better term, template. It's not a template though, because a template gives them some words that they can actually have in there. But I tell them every topic sentence has to have transitional language, a reference to what their example will be in a broader sense, and then a reference to their argument that somehow relates to their thesis. So those 3 parts are always in every topic sentence. But at the beginning of the year, I give my students a list of transitions that are not rudimentary in nature. So it'll actually say transition words for contrast, transition words for coordination, transition words for, and so they have a nice list, and they could say, okay, if this paragraph contrasts the paragraph that came before it, I need to pull from this particular list. If this paragraph is meant to build upon what came before it, I need to put this here. If this paragraph is meant to be like the foundational example, so I do some elements of chronology, but never first, second, third, or last. It would be like foundationally, primarily, or on top of all of this, that kind of a thing. And if anybody's looking for those, for a list of what that looks like, I think in my former life, I did the AP Daily videos. And in one of my AP Daily videos that's on AP Classroom, I'm pretty sure I put transitional language in there, like that chart of transitional language. So you could easily just take a screenshot and just print that. So that's one of the ways that I do it. So my students know that they are required. So whenever we do anything in class, if they write a paragraph, I'm like, everybody, take out your paragraph, look at your topic sentence, and I make them highlight each part. And if it's not there, I'm like, we got to add that part, and you better do it before you turn it in, because I'm going to grade it, and I want to make sure I can give you the most amount of points. And they're like, wait a second, you're not going to just grade it and take off because we didn't have it? And I'm like, no, I actually, want you to realize that I'm a gracious human being. And because of that, that's how I work with that. But anyway, Beth, do you have anything about interconnecting their paragraphs?
Yeah,
I have one more thing after, but up to you.
So I think we do something very similar with the topic sentences. That's where the transition happens. So just a quick activity that may or may not be useful at this point in the year. If your students are struggling with their topic sentences, something I did a couple years ago, it was for rhetorical analysis, but you could easily adopt it for synthesis or argument, is I had students write their thesis and then their topic sentences for their body paragraphs, even the first sentence of their conclusion, on separate index cards. and they shuffled them up. So there were only like 4 or 5 index cards, but they then had to give it to a partner, and their partner had to put it in order. And for the students who didn't have a strong topic sentence, it was harder, especially for those body paragraphs, for somebody to figure out which one went first. And so if the person got it wrong and it was like a legitimate, like, hey, there wasn't a good transition here, then they had to revise. And it was a really quick activity, but it helped them realize that their essay needs a structure. But yeah, I have a couple of sentence frames that I use with my students too for those topic sentences, because that's essentially the idea that they're trying to prove. And I also am pretty big on concluding sentences too, just because I've read so many essays where the student wrote a decent paragraph, but then by the time I got to the end, I was like, okay, wait a minute, what are you proving again? Like, how does this relate to your thesis? And so it's like, because AP readers read so many essays, sometimes it's really nice when students kind of purposefully wrap it up and tie it back to their thesis. So I would say concluding sentences are just as important as topic sentences, but that's where they start to get that structure.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about vocab here, and then we'll move on to some other questions. When it comes to vocab in my classroom, I do 2 things for vocab instruction. First of all, I am not the type of person that makes kids circle every time they read in their readings. Read in their readings. So that's, yeah. It's almost 9, right? But anyway, I'm not the type of person that says, hey, you have to circle every vocab word and then go look it up, because it's not going to happen. And on test day, that's not a skill that's going to work, because there's no dictionary allowed and stuff like that. So what I do in my classroom is I tell my students that they need to, when they see a word that they don't know, they're going to circle it, but then they're going to draw arrows to context clues, because a lot of times they're not going to be able to know, they won't know the word, but there will be context clues that will at least let them say, I at least know that this word relates to science, or I at least know that this word relates to something because of that. And as my students get used to that, they know if a word is circled, if there's no arrows to context clues, that Freitas is going to be livid, because it's like, no. You need to be prepared to not know what a word means. And this happens to me in my classroom all the time. A kid will be, I had a student who asked me what mendacious meant today. And I'm like, I have no idea. And unfortunately, I can't even give you context clues because it's a single word in a multiple choice answer. And I'm like, it is what it is, guys. Like, I can tell you this, though. I know that that's the correct answer. So whether or not I know what mendacious means doesn't matter for right now on test day. The other thing that I do a lot in my classroom with vocabulary is I try to make it as organic as possible. So as we share our writing, if a student uses a great word as he or she is sharing or writing, I write it on the board and I'm like, hey, folks, when you revise your paragraph, can you try to put that word in your paper? Can you try that out? And then we kind of create like, especially at the beginning of the year, we kind of create like this vocab list. And I'm like, can you get this in there? Can you get this in there? And then because of that, when I celebrate the word in class and then say, hey, everybody, let's all revise right now and do that, and I give them the time to, they're actually using it in context, in reality, and you're not just like kind of matching things up. So now my kids are learning how to use context clues for reading time. And, I also tell my kids, like, this is not just a test day strategy. When you're at your first job interview and that person says something that you don't have a clue about and you don't want to look dumb, if you have context clue abilities, like you'll be like, oh, I don't know what that means. But, let's say for some reason, you're interviewing as a nurse and someone asks about when blood coagulates and you're like, I don't know what coagulate means. Then suddenly you're like, you get a context clue about something crusting over and you're like, oh, wait, I can figure this out. I know it's gross, but, it is what it is. Just that kind of a thing. It's not a test day skill. It's a life skill. And because of that, the kids really kind of pick up on that. So I do that with vocab. But what about you, Beth?
I do something very similar. The past couple weeks, I've been adding in like words of the week. It's kind of something our district asked us to do. The kids so far have actually kind of liked it, but one of the things that I require for that as part of like our school-wide initiative is they have to write a sentence using the word. And I want like an academic sentence, like connected to something we're talking about in class. And I have to be able to infer the meaning of the word from their sentence. So they have to give me the context clues in the sentence. And that has kind of helped build their vocabulary a little bit. It's just something we're trying as a district. But overall, yeah, pointing out when a student has used a word well and getting other students to try to use that word can be very helpful. Just because a lot of times I've seen students try to use words that they don't know what it means, but like they know it's a fancy word, or like clearly like they pulled out a thesaurus when they were writing their assignment at home. And then it's like, oh,
Sweet, right?
like you don't know what this means, do you? So we want to make sure that they know the meaning, because you can come across as really pretentious if you include all these words that like, are too academic. So that's something to keep in mind too. I think it's like a slow process. And unfortunately, by the time they're juniors, I don't want to say it's like we can't fix it, but we have so many other things to focus on that I wish vocabulary was perhaps more emphasized in earlier grades, but that's like a totally separate conversation.
Yeah. That's when we go try to change the world one elementary school at a time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Another question here, right? And this is, how do we reconcile our passion for teaching with the reality of teaching a course that ends with an exam that you ultimately really want your students to pass? And then this person said, I feel like I'm putting so much pressure on myself about test scores that it's wearing me down. Any advice for, learning to relax and whatnot? So I'm going to just see this. I'm going to ask if this person is a first-year teacher or not. Typically, I'm just wondering. Brandy, are you a first-year teacher? Can you toss that in the chat? If you're still in here, that is. I think you are, though. My answer to that question is this. Okay. Third-year AP teacher. Okay, cool. Thank you for clarifying for that, right? The first thing that I say about this is that although I don't love that the test is timed, the test does test the skills of the class. And so I don't picture my class as test prep. I picture my class as skill prep, and then we really work on time. I mean, I start getting really strict about time at the end of quarter three. No, middle of quarter two and end of quarter three, I start to really put the time on. But what I do is I focus so much on the kids' skill development, especially at the beginning of the year. I mean, I didn't even give my first time writing until the end of November. And my second time writing was probably, I don't know, mid-January. I don't focus on the timing. I focus on the skill. And I have noticed that since I take so much time with each skill in terms of writing in my class without doing it in a time setting, that if I really slow down with the skill, the kids adopt that into their writing, and they can actually do that in the time setting because we've spent so much time practicing and whatnot. And so the test kind of works itself out because I focus so much on the skills and I spend so much time. Like, honestly, I see some people talking about how they give a timed writing every week or every 2 weeks or, all of these things. And I'm like, wow, I gave my first time writing at the end of November. And I'm not judging other people that do that. I just don't understand how their schedules can work like that. Because I'm like, I don't even know how I would work that into my schedule to get kids doing timed writings like that every week. And I'm like, kudos to them, because those kids are going in with a lot of comfort on test day when it comes to time. But for my students, what I do is I keep my passion for teaching English because I'm like, here's my skill. And I get all jazzed up about my skill, and I give the kids a bunch of time to get hopefully jazzed up like I am in practice. And then I finally say at the end of quarter two and the beginning of quarter three, all right, now I'm going to put some timing pressure on. But the kids are so comfortable with the skills that they're like, okay, you can kind of turn up the heat a little bit. And that's how I keep my passion to go there. And the test scores kind of work themselves out. I will say this, though. My test scores really started getting better when two things happened. Number one, I used to teach remedial freshman English, and I started teaching my AP Lang class with all of the accommodations except for extra time. So I looked at my kids' IEPs, picked out every accommodation, teacher notes, visual reinforcements, all of those things that sometimes I feel like plague us. And I said, I'm going to give that to every single one of my kids in my AP class and see what happens. Boom. AP scores through the roof. Kids do fine in college. They come back and tell me all the time. The next time that I saw a huge increase in grading was when I let the kids do their rewrites for their timed writings, because it lowered the affective filter on test day. They went back and they reevaluated their skills. And sure enough, it seems to be a win-win. So that's just some of my advice there for that. What about you, Beth?
Yeah, so I have very similar thoughts, but I'm going to kind of answer the question a little bit differently because this year, possibly also last year, there were moments where I was like, getting really frustrated. It's usually the beginning of the year with my sophomores, and I have this, I'm the class where they suddenly have to write, and that's super frustrating for them, and sometimes it's frustrating for me. And there's moments where, because it's the process, sometimes the joy gets sucked out of it. And one piece of advice that somebody gave me several years ago was keep like all the thank you notes you get, all the awesome emails you get, any letters you get, and like put it in a file. So there are days, like if I have a hard day, I will like go and open that file and just read some of those notes, because it reminds me of my purpose, and it reminds me that like, hey, I can do this and things get better. And because I'll read it and I'll be like, oh, I remember that student. Yeah, that student, when they first started, they hated English, but by the end of the year, they had grown so much. And then it helps me put everything into perspective for like the new group. So I don't know if that's kind of what this person was going through, but like that's something that I've done too, is because sometimes I think we like teaching can be a thankless job at times. And so sometimes we need to remind ourselves like, yeah, what we're doing has value and like we have a purpose as well. So kind of like a separate way to address that question, but that's just something that I've done as well. And so that might help if anyone feels like they're in a rut or something.
All right, Beth, I'm down for one more question, even though we're a little bit over. If you're down for one more question.
That's fine. We had some tech problems, so let's do one more.
Seriously. Oh, you know what? Maybe we could do two. One question was once again about multiple choice, just the best tips, which I think we said, a practice exam is key. I also give my kids a bunch of practice, but I don't make them do it in AP Classroom. I actually print them out. I've got a bunch of like the old form stuff from way back in the day, and I just print them out and I cross out the questions that are no longer accurate to the course and exam description, and just say, hey, listen, you got 15 minutes today. And I try to do that every Monday, just so they've got consistent practice with multiple choice. And I do give them a grade for that. Some people are like, no, you should never. Luckily, it's my classroom, so I can do what I want. But the way that I do it is if kids get half right, they get 20 out of 25 points, which is the equivalent of an 80. And, as the kids practice throughout the year, they start getting more and more used to things. The other thing, too, though, is that I have the AMSCO textbook, and my students all have a copy of that. And there's so much multiple choice practice in there. But what's nice about it is that it's always according to the unit that they're reading. So the kids aren't going outside of those skills. So I can kind of be like, listen, as you read through here, focus on these multiple choice questions with these skills. But are there any other multiple choice additions besides the fact that we talked about the lead distractors and taking a practice multiple choice that you're like, oh, this might work too?
No, honestly, I think we've kind of covered it. Other than as far as going over multiple choice, one thing that I've done that has helped is I'll have kids discuss the answer in like pairs or small groups so they learn from each other, because I have found that sometimes they can explain it to each other better than I can explain the right answer. So if you have kids where it's like kind of struggling in terms of clicking, like then have them work together. And so I've done that in a variety of different ways, but that has really helped too, because sometimes like they can explain it to each other better than I can explain it as their teacher.
All right, let's look at what it says here. It's something about looping. It says, how do you guys structure the class and keep looping the 3 different writing skills in March and April? I'm trying to, but the kids are forgetting or mixing what is needed for each essay. So I actually teach each essay in isolation throughout the year.
Me too.
Like I get kids to do rhetorical analysis, then argument, then synthesis. So that's the first way that I keep them from overlapping. But the reason why I do it that way is because argument and synthesis are basically the same thing. One, you just have to integrate textual evidence. So my kids don't really confuse that. But when I come back after I do those 3, which is what I'm doing now, I lead into, I love satire. And I know it's not going to be on the exam, but I love it. So I do a satire unit where we really focus on rhetorical analysis and actually creating arguments that are satirical. But when we practice rhetorical analysis to get them back in the swing of things, what I then do is we write practice essays. I make them use, we read a bunch of satire. We write rhetorical analyses of satirical essays, but for their timed writing at the end of that unit, I give them the argument prompt of what is the role of the satirist in the community. And they don't see it coming. And I'm like, that's the irony of the whole thing, because you've been prepared for this and I just gave you all of the evidence that you need. And then they actually do quite fine. The other thing too, though, is that someone asked about the kids mixing up their writing. I will tell you that until February, I let my kids use all of their notes on their timed writings. So they can use any templates and or structures that I've given them before, but they have to do it within the time constraints. So the kids come in, they've got their argument templates right there or their rhetorical analysis, and they know it's right here and they can use those. And that's one of the ways that I get them kind of like ingrained in their minds so that when it comes time for me to pull that away at the end of February or the beginning of February, most of the time, not this year though, at the end of February, then boom, it's in there. And that's how they don't kind of mix and match anymore. So there are a couple ways that I do it. Over to you, Beth.
I do something very similar. We start with rhetorical analysis. My kids move to synthesis because they are better at synthesis than argument usually because they like the concrete. So I do synthesis in like the second 9 weeks. We go back to rhetorical analysis and kind of sprinkle in argument. And then I would say the last like month before the exam, usually what I do, honestly, is I turn it over to my students. And after they've done their mock, I'll say, you know, what do you want to work on? Last year, they wanted more synthesis. This year, I'm not sure what it'll be, but I kind of let them choose. But I think teaching it in longer blocks kind of helps. Like I don't strictly follow the College Board's units. Mostly because before they came out with the units, I had a syllabus that kind of worked for me and my needs anyway. But I have found that if I switch too quickly, students get lost, kind of like what people have already said in the comments. So I stick with one type for a while. But I think if I look at what I teach the most, it's probably rhetorical analysis, but then I group argument and synthesis together. It's the same skills. So as long as you hit those skills and your students are comfortable with it, I think you're okay. But yeah, I don't switch as often as I think some teachers do. Like I have a tutoring student who they do 3 weeks of one essay, 3 weeks of another, 3 weeks of another, and like nothing wrong with that, but I can see how that would be confusing. So for me and my sanity, I like to build it up longer than a 3-week period.
I also like to coincide my underclassmen with what I'm doing with the AP Lang. So that like if I'm doing rhetorical analysis with my Lang kids in essay form, I'm doing rhetorical analysis in paragraph form with my younger classes. So that I'm like, okay, I'm in the swing of just creating the same type of material here for that.
Yeah, that's super helpful as well.
Yeah. Somebody asked about a great section to come that comes to mind for multiple choice in the AMSCO textbook. I can tell you that I think that chapters 2, 5, and 9 are the best chapters in the AMSCO book, I think. I think those are the best ones. But if you couldn't tell, that's because those are the ones that I wrote. So I'm just kidding around. They're all good. They're all good. The benefit for the person who asked the question about the AMSCO text is that in each chapter, the multiple choice questions only match with that particular unit and the content that was on the pages that precede it. And so that helps kids to kind of get a little bit more confidence. Now, if you're looking to get kids to be more confident in their multiple choice, I would say the first 3 units of the AMSCO textbook are best because those are the foundational skills. And I have noticed that my kids typically score higher in the first 3 units than the other ones because they're a little bit less nuanced because they're so foundational. But the other thing too is that there are unit reviews at the end of each chapter that go into other units as well in the AMSCO text. So you can broaden their horizons even within unit 1 because it'll tell you, oh, these questions come from units 5 and 6. These questions come from units 7 and 8 and things like that. I hope that answered your question a little bit. If I were to give my kids definitely something though, if they haven't touched it, I would give them unit 1 in particular because unit 1 deals with such the foundations of the rhetorical situation and argument. So it takes care of both in both the reading and the writing. And that's really good for the kids because once you can really understand the foundations of argument in the rhetorical situation, almost all of the other multiple choice questions will fall into place if they can become really confident in the unit 1 in particular. So I'm just tossing that one out there. All right. Did I miss anything else? Are there any final questions? I'm happy to answer one more if one pops up. But other than that, I'm going to go to bed. Let's see.
I didn't see any more in the chat, but if people have questions, they're welcome to email us too. Yeah. We're going to be doing a student session as well. I put the link in the chat earlier. So we would love it if you would, now that we have all the tech problems worked out and only one version of me on the call, we would love it if you would recommend it to your students coming up. So anyway, thank you everyone for coming. And I'll include my email list here. I don't know, Tim, if you have one, but if people want to sign up to receive emails from me, I'll put the link there But Tim and I both respond to emails too. So if you guys ever have questions, just email us. And then Tim's ultimate review packets there as well. Great resource. So yeah, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, and I'm gonna actually end with the ultimate review packet. I just encourage you to, if your kids are looking for extra study materials, rather than send them to like a Barron's or a 5 Steps to a 5 or a Princeton Review, we produce an ultimate review packet which coincides with our YouTube videos, but it's a little bit more in-depthly goes through all 9 units of the course and exam description. It gives the kids a practice exam. It gives them another opportunity to take a scored practice exam by other people. So they can actually purchase that for like $13, and they can get that sent out and get that scored by actual AP teachers and get a detailed scoring report back and things like that. And so if your kids are looking, if they're going to spend money on a Barron's or whatever, I promise you that this is more fun and more thorough just because it's in video form. And in total, we produced over 408 pages worth of activities, guided notes, answer guides, tests, and rationales. And there's a lot of self-study stuff for kids in there too. So I just put that right in there. If you consider recommending that to your kids, that'd be awesome. But we still want to make sure that you all know this is free and the student study sessions are free. That's just an added resource that we have. But we put over 1,000 hours into it. So because of that, that can't be free. And I'm not trying to be a jerk about that. Okay. So anyway, I appreciate you all. Did we put the wrong link in there for the Whitehall part? I don't know.
I think the one I posted worked. I'm not sure though. Someone said it did.
Let's see. I'm gonna look right now. Oh yeah, right there. Yeah, that one works. The one that you just posted works. So that should be there. So all right. I don't have an email list, Coach. So just so you know, I guess I got to get into the.
You need to get one. Frame. It's fun.
Yeah, I have to do a lot of things that I don't do. So I appreciate you, Beth. I'm going to sign this off now, and then I'll send you the. We should be able to both access the recording. You can post it on your channel, and I'll post it on mine too. Okay.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, and thank you everybody else.
Thank you everybody else for supporting. Have a great night.